Yeah, here's the interesting thing is I've seen those teams before where
Okay.
they state outwardly like, oh, we don't follow process, we just get stuff done. What's really funny is that when you dig in with them and you have like and you follow them and you shadow them, they have a process. They just don't want to call it that.
Yeah. It's
And
not written
so
down anywhere, but
it's not.
you need to learn it.
But what they did was they came together. They have a framework that they work. They know how to communicate. They have like they know each other like the back of their hands. They know the strengths and weaknesses of those high functioning, high performance teams. They have a process. It's just not stated. It's not something they refer back to, right? And so oftentimes I'll sit down with them and say, "Walk me through your week."
CTO Scott Roehrenbeck discusses process improvement and team building, exploring how to balance structure with flexibility, support team autonomy, and align outputs with business goals.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Leadership Exchange. I'm your host, Rob Ocel, the VP of Innovation at This.Labs. Today, I'm excited to be talking to Scott Roehrenbeck. Scott is the CTO of Apptegy. Scott, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing really wonderful. We're going to have a really good conversation around process improvement and supporting people and kind of the best ways to do that. And you know what? This is the perfect kind of podcast for having these kinds of conversations because this is certainly a topic that leaders deal with and talk about all the time. But before we get started on that, can you maybe just give us a little bit of an introduction to yourself and kind of how you became the CTO of Apptegy?
Yeah, for sure. So I've been in technology for a little over 20 years. I came out of college during the dot-com boom, and that's a great time to, or let me restate, it was the dot-com bust, not the boom, the opposite of it. So it's
honestly, one led quickly into the other. So
exactly, they didn't last very long, right? So came out of college with a degree and was ready to get going, and not a whole lot of jobs, and so with that. I jumped in and took, a job that was a field technician for a regional bank, and really, it was a job. It was something that got me taken care of, but I really wanted to get into more of software development. So my career took a lot of twists and turns in getting to that path, but eventually landed at a number of companies and leading multiple teams in different disciplines. And so where my current stint is with Apptegy. It's a great company. I've loved it. Beginning to lead the full engineering department. Very different set of challenges, but it's just been kind of that culmination of leading a lot of different teams and a lot of different challenges and coming together with an awesome organization that's growing and sees a lot of challenges with emerging at a startup stage.
Yeah, isn't that really interesting? I mean, just how much history is so cyclical. It's sometimes difficult to explain. Every situation is a little bit different, but between you were talking about coming in around the dot-com bust. I came into the industry around the sort of the 2008 period. I got to experience both sides of that. And now even that still feels pretty recent to me, but a large proportion of people, certainly in the tech space, in the big tech space, have entered the workforce after that. So This current kind of turmoil in the big tech space is their first time experiencing this kind of situation. And it's kind of funny when you started to been around a couple of these and you kind of look at people and you're like, another one of these.
Yeah. And I remember the 2007 collapse. I remember when Lehman Brothers declared their insolvency. I was in a conference room working for a bank at the time. So it's a whole different level of stress, like going through that and seeing other banks while working for a bank. I mean, you get used to it. I have a brother-in-law that works in the oil industry, and they see a whole lot of more of these and a much, peaks and valleys as they make their way through it. You get used to it, but yeah, tech it's a very different beast with it when you go through these different milestones.
But it's kind of one of the things about leadership that's really difficult, right? We talk about this. I talked about this with a lot of people. You can rise to a level of seniority on a contributor basis just by learning a lot of things. But it's like
That's right.
Leadership really is an accumulation of wisdom. Coming out of the sort of the 2008 downturn, I was in government consulting at the time, and a mantra, sort of an idea of doing appropriations around lowest cost, technically feasible is what they called it. Mm-hmm. And so it was really this idea that it didn't matter there was no idea of paying for premiums. You literally had to give the lowest possible number that would still work. And that just created all sorts of bizarre incentives that affected the sort of software delivery and consulting services.
Big time.
And, now even doing private consulting in this kind of environment, you hear a lot of the same things coming out of companies. Like, we understand, you might be able to offer a premium. We understand that you'll account for things, but we need the lowest possible number that'll still get us to the finish line. And so it's been very interesting to be able to take the lessons learned from that first round and apply them to the future. Certainly.
Big time. Yeah. I've lived that in my life as well too, of, I like to do things differently. I'm a very, relationship focused person, meaning that I like to focus on the individuals that you're helping to solve problems for. I like to really wrap how we think about it in that particular way. I think that's a unique piece in how we frankly should bring humanity into technology. But yeah, then it gets to, okay, but yeah, so how much is it going to cost? And so how can you differentiate, still do those things, but also while, working against some of those constraints? It's hard. It's a big challenge in the environment for sure.
Yeah, well, we've talked about it a lot on this podcast about that idea of owning the middle. I mean, you wish there was an easy answer, just support people 100% all the way. But if you chew up all your budget just supporting people, it's going to run out, right? And so at some level, you have to exercise discretion. And it is in that discretion that your authority and your leadership springs from. So
it's hard. That's right. That's that soft skill, and refining those soft skills around how do you work your way through leadership. And we talk a lot about that within, all the different companies that I visit with, and certainly within the company I'm in right now, of, not everyone has the soft skill of leadership, or they may not even enjoy that aspect of it. And that's okay. There's still growth in the architecture realm of wanting to go very deep into technology, right? But you're right. Leadership is about collecting experiences. It's about understanding and being able to connect dots. But it's also, it's a really unique ability to tell that story to a different audience each time. And so to me, that's one of the biggest parts that you have to think about when you're a leader is how do I get them to understand, I had this experience. I think they're going to hear this a little bit differently. How do I tune this so that they get the perspective of what's going on? Because you can't tell it the same way each time, but you need the end result to be the same each time. It's a big challenge. It's hard.
Yeah. And it depends a lot too with how big the group is that you're saying to. That's the other thing to manage. It's it might feel some messages, a leadership team might say, oh, well, we have an offsite coming up. We're gonna have the whole company listening, so we can get that message out to everyone all at once. And sometimes you have to be the person in the room that says, no, this is a message that has to go to everyone, but individually, so that you can tell that exactly the way they need to hear. Well, other things can be broad, but what you have to do to messaging, even if you tell it to 3 to 4 people, is vastly different, like you're saying, than what you can do if you can give it to people one at a time.
100%. Yep. And being able to read reactions when you have a smaller group and being able to see if what you're saying resonates or if there's confusion, it's always easier with that. And then there's other times where you really do need it to be heard the same way across the whole company, department, whichever. And in that instance, you got to be a bit more crisp. You got to be a bit clearer in what's coming across. But you also probably need to anticipate that what you're going to say to a larger group, you're probably going to hear more feedback just because, or you hope to, right? You want to hear more of that feedback on where something was confusing or it didn't land.
Yeah.
And so you have to me, it's always about that end stage of when you end that, what is your follow up to be sure that as you communicate that, did people hear it the way that you intended to, or was there an aspect of it that you didn't account for, and how do you work your way through that? And a big part in conversations, there's a bit, the book name is escaping me, but it's always about how do you set the table for the next conversation? Because this conversation should never be an end, right? You don't ever want them to end. You always want there to be a dialogue. And so it's about setting the table for that next conversation, right? And making sure that when you've ended that conversation, that the next one's there whenever they're ready to have that, or if you want to carry that one forward. So anytime I end a large group conversation, I try to be sure that I've teed it up for an individual follow-up or a group follow-up to continue it, to keep it going.
That's an interesting way of putting it. I hadn't really thought about that with messaging, but I've often done that with education. So sometimes I like to have the meeting with a new team member where it's just a fire hose of information. And I just say up front, I say, listen, everything I'm about to say is a fire hose. You will not remember it all. You can try to take notes, but you won't even understand your notes later. The point is, you just need to hear all these things once.
Let them gel.
So that when you hear them again, you go, oh, I remember hearing that. It's to really so I like that idea that sometimes you're having a conversation and isn't necessarily the result of that conversation that you're necessarily worrying about. It's what will be continuing experience they'll have the next conversation they have.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that, so if you think about onboarding and bringing new people into an environment, the fire hose method's great. because you know that there is going to be moments in the future where they get to go deeper through those particular items. You just want them aware generally of the landscape. That's a really great method for doing that. But when you're really wanting to make sure that they get something and they understand like a big change or an announcement or whatever else, that's really that's where setting the table to me is really important, right? And so it's just and then going back to what you're saying earlier, this is the challenge of leadership, is like you have 50 different levers that you can pull. And you might think you're going to pull the second lever, and you pull that second lever and you're like, sweet, that works. And then half of it didn't land, right? And so you're stepping back and you're evaluating. And so those learned experiences of then how do you take that and carry that to the next one and hopefully see a better result? But sometimes you won't, right? But it's that drive and that want to understand that and understand how to get people to ultimately understand where we want to go. Right. And constantly changing, constantly adapting, constantly, evolving in that process, and knowing that they're doing the same thing. So what worked the previous time may not work in this instance just because stuff changes.
Yeah, I like that. All right. Well, we have more to this conversation, but before we continue, I just wanted to take a second to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs. This.Labs is a consultancy focused on helping companies with their digital transformation efforts. And that might sound like a buzzword, but what it means is helping companies align their business objectives with their digital efforts, whether that be replatforming, modernizing, or spinning up new projects. This.Dot has worked with companies like Stripe, Xero, Wikimedia, DocuSign, and Twilio. Check them out at this.co. One more time, that's THISDOT.co. All right, now back to our show. So, Scott, we've been having a bit of a conversation. We've been dancing around the topic, I think, a little bit. But one of the things that we really wanted to talk about was this idea of process and kind of what it means and how it affects people and how we really support people through it. But, I don't want to go all the way back to the dictionary definition, but I think certainly when people hear process, there's a certain fraction of people that just immediately tune out. And there's a certain set of people that come to it immediately with a certain process in mind. So I guess let's start out by just sort of saying, for the parts that make you excited, what is process as you choose to think about it? Like when you're talking about being excited about this topic, for you, like what is the purpose of process and, why this is an interesting topic and a thing to optimize?
Yeah, definitely. No, and you're right. Process, it can be a 4-letter word. People can see it as a restrictive, bureaucratic, something that makes everything grind to a halt. But it doesn't have to be. But what it does is it's kind of, I think of it as, it's an interstate that can lead you somewhere. You can choose to get off the interstate if you want to and get back on later. But it's a way so that everyone kind of understands the path of where we got to go. There's also a degree of autonomy and the route that you choose to take on that interstate. And I think all too often that's something that gets overlooked in organizations that are struggling with things beyond process. But it's the word that I think a lot of people reach for in hoping to fix those external forces. And that's sadly that it's going to help you gain visibility into where your problems are, but it's not going to fix them.
Yeah.
And so often, go ahead, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so often when I think about when you get into process discussions, and I've had this conversation with several companies, and it's a conversation we're having on a daily basis of, is how do we get the decision of how we think about our process, how do we get it closest to those that it's impacted on a day-to-day basis, to where we still get the ability to understand and we can be confident in what's going to be delivered, but letting them have the autonomy to make those decisions and be able to adapt what they need for their own unique needs. Whereas I think often companies choose to say, nope, we're going to standardize everything. Everything's going to be done the exact same way. There is an argument for that. I do agree in consistency, but some of the adaptations of that do need to be taken to the team so they can figure out what makes the most sense for them. They can adjust some of the items, right? And so I talk a lot about when you think about process and you think about how do you get a company with the right thing for what they need. And there's a number of things that you got to go through when you're assessing what's the right process for this company or this team. And I'm a big believer in relationship first. You need to understand the people that are in your organization, not just in your engineering or product departments. You need to understand a more broad sense too. And number two, you also need to understand your business overall objectives and where the business wants to go. Those two things are really key. If you ignore those two things and you go implement something, you're likely it's going to be harder. You're going to miss something, whichever, right? And so you start there. And then after that, you start to figure out like, what are the key challenges that they have? What are organizational challenges? What are interpersonal challenges on teams and so forth? You can kind of sort your way through those. But the thing that I think a lot of times people fall into is they manage the process, which kind of entrenches that bureaucratic view of like, well, we didn't go through these steps, therefore we failed. And I think that there's a reason to have that conversation, but the things we should be managing is more of the outputs rather than the process.
Yeah.
And so
it's funny too, because I think that with process, people have a misunderstanding of what it is, right? Mm-hmm. Like I think if you think about working in a kitchen or cooking something, process is not the recipe. Process is the knife skills.
That's right.
Process is the order in which you generally do things. It's the way that you organize your ingredients. It's where you put things so that they're ready when you're ready to cook. It's not the recipe. So
that's right.
So, I think business people would be good to understand that, but I think it's also important for, team members and contributors to understand that just because you do Agile, just because you do CMMI, doesn't magically make your company successful. And just because those things aren't about the outputs themselves doesn't mean the process doesn't deliver value.
That's right.
Because
that's right.
If you go work in that messy kitchen where everything's everywhere, and then you go work in a clean kitchen where everything's clearly labeled and just intuitively you can understand where things are, even if you've never worked in that kitchen, you'll understand that there is value at least to some form of process.
That's right. And at the end of the day, in both of those situations, both of those, as you say, kitchens, both of those could be failing restaurants.
Yeah.
Both of those also could be highly functional kitchens, right? And so that's where, to me, like that process just more makes it as a more clear area to go get work done. But the work itself still has to happen, and you have to be sure, to continue your analogy, you have to be sure that plated dish that you brought out is what you expected it to be. Right. And so losing sight of that, you can over process things and you can overdo, but still the output, the customer might not have liked the meal. Right. And so that's the main thing you have to watch, and you have to be sure, because without the other, you could still find failure. Right. And so that's the main part you have to be driving, and making sure those that are, and again, I'm continuing your analogy, making sure those cooks, the chef, every piece that's in play understands what it is that you're managing. What is our ultimate goal in this? And making sure that they understand this is what success means. And this is purely the highway that we're getting there, right? This is what's taking us to that. And so I think if you can get an organization to understand that the process is not the thing that we're delivering, it's helping us get there. And it's being able to help you find your inefficiencies that you can hopefully turn more, right? Or turn it better. That's the whole emphasis on when we talk about process improvement and people improvement. Like that's where those two things come together. If you can get an organization squared around that, that's where the fun starts.
And, maybe some people that work in enterprise environments find it hard to believe that there can be teams or entire organizations that operate without process, like quite literally without process, or I should say all of it is ad hoc. There's no such thing as no process, right? It's just a completely ad hoc process. You couldn't repeat it with another group of people. One of the things that I'm curious about is if you were to work with an organization like that or take over the leadership of an organization like that, like, do you believe that you should start with some sort of framework just to show people what a fully fledged process is? Or do you believe in that kind of evolutionary thing where it's like, listen, we're just going to do this one thing consistently, and if we like it, we're going to do that some more plus this other thing. And then we're going to do, and then look, now we have a process. Like, do you believe in that kind of evolutionary approach? Or do you think there's something to like, no, I'm going to put a framework around you. Some of it's going to feel arbitrary. You're not going to like some of it, but over time you will learn what all these pieces are.
Yeah. Here's the interesting thing is I've seen those teams before where they state outwardly like, oh, we don't follow process. We just get stuff done. What's really funny is that when you dig in with them and you follow them and you shadow them, they have a process. They just don't want to call it that.
Yeah. It's not written down anywhere.
It's not.
You need to learn it.
But what they did was they came together. They have a framework that they work. They know how to communicate. They have they know each other like the back of their hands. They know the strengths and weaknesses of those high functioning, high performance teams. They have a process. It's just not stated. It's not something they refer back to, right? And so oftentimes I'll sit down with them and say, walk me through your week. Just walk me through. Like when you see this kind of challenge, what do you do? When you're hearing something new that you go work on, like what are the things that you do? And oftentimes what they describe is so very close to what you would want to implement in like an agile framework. And so when you're walking through it, and this is why I say relationship first is important, is that you're walking a day in their shoes and you understand, so that when you bring that framework forward, they're like, yeah, that's what we've been doing. We just didn't want to call it that. Right. And so it's about understanding what they go through. It's about understanding what gets them to that high performance. And then it's also like then challenging them to taking what they do. They can call it whatever they want. Right. But then challenging others to pick up those cues. Because that's, at the end of the day, that's what we're after. We're after a team that leans in together. They work together. There's the right level of visibility. So if they need help, we can help them, right? And then it's also being able to be confident back to the business and saying, yes, we're on track for that thing. And here's when, y'all can expect to be able to see that. And here's what it's going to look like. And so it's putting that at the team level to you obviously have a base and a foundation that has consistency. You want to have some degree of consistency across your org. But then it's letting those teams kind of fine tune the things that they need to get the most out of them. And then challenging them to say, to the outputs, like run after those, follow these things so that we can help you. But otherwise, let's go get some work done and let's take care of it. If we get those things delivered, we do them the way that we need to, process gets out of the way.
So to push into this a little bit further, though, because I'm starting to realize now how much this conversation sounds a lot like a build versus buy conversation on the technical front. How do you guide teams through this, right? Because obviously if you adopt a methodology that is widespread, CMMI or Agile or whatever else, it comes with a whole host of educational materials, consultants, other people have operated within it. And so it's easier to maybe recruit people into your way of doing things. But obviously it is rigid in certain ways, which your team will not appreciate, but obviously offers a lot of what your team would hopefully want and need. So when you look at that idea, do we formalize the process we have now and continue to evolve it? That's where you get the people that say like, oh, we're agile like, or we are, this methodology like, but we have our own spin on it. Versus like saying, hey, no, we should hem pretty close to the core framework of this. So like, how do you, I guess, guide that build versus buy thing when it comes to process for teams?
Yeah. And I think this is one of those things where, unfortunately, when you get into some of the agile practices, that if you take it, so the original, the Agile Manifesto, the way that it was built out, it was really just meant to be loose tenets of,
yeah.
These are the things that we should aspire. These are the ideals, the philosophies that we should be thinking about. And that kind of caught fire. And then there was a number of different frameworks that rose up around that to give it more structure. Right. And there's a lot of different like rigidity in the different frameworks. Kanban goes one way, Scrum goes another. Yeah, Safe is layer on top of that. So there's all these different flavors that go with that. Right. And all of them have different rigidities that come with that. And so there's never, I don't personally view that there's a one size fits all. I think there's always, you have to recognize that there's some things in each of these frameworks that are very strong and some things that are not. Right. But so I tend to want to say, let's start rigid at first. Mm-hmm. Let's start rigid at first. Let's all foundationally, let's set on this. Let's go rigid at first. Right. Let's walk our way through the life the way that it is written. And let's see what pain points that we have, and then let's empower teams. Or did that rigidity make it so much more difficult, or is this just change, right? And having that conversation. And you can do these things through a quick period of time, right? You can push teams to go through those in a way so that it doesn't have to be drawn out over years. You can do this inside of a matter of months, but it's about having and empowering those teams of, hey, the outputs weren't there. Here's where we measured that these particular areas were off. What did we feel like were the problems? Oh, we had stand-ups every day. Okay, cool. Do y'all want to make them 3 times a week and a virtual on Tuesday, Thursday? Would that be helpful? Hey, let's give that a shot, right? Yeah. And so it's kind of that, like, let's start rigid first. Let's all work from that. And then we adapt to the pain points until we get our outputs finely tuned to exactly what we're trying to hit.
Yeah. And I guess talk a little bit more about that process of adaptation and how you decide what adaptations to make. I mean, it's one thing to just say, hey, let's try something, right? But I think at the end of the day, you have to understand what you're hoping to accomplish with what you're trying. Yep. And, you and I talked briefly before we had this conversation around, we're all used to working in an environment, especially if you have a decent enough hiring pipeline. A conversation here, a lot of, well, at a place I used to work, they did this type of thing. So, in the idea of this process improvement, like what is driving what you try, and how do you sell what it is you're trying to do, rather than just, I prefer it this way. Because at the end of the day, that's not an interesting, at least in my opinion. I mean, at least it's the beginnings of a conversation, but it's certainly not an interesting enough one to drive a whole team and say, well, I prefer it this way. How do you kind of guide, and what is the North Star for those kind of process improvement conversations?
Yeah, those are hard. The thing that always gets tough is when you boil down into what I consider to be a religious argument, right? There's not a right or wrong answer in either one of these things. It's just more of like, this is my preference versus that, and those are hard. So I always talk about what are your outputs and what are you measuring, right? And so the process really aids to those two things. And so you have to, in my mind, you have to start at the end and then move backwards from there. So if the team understands what are the outputs we expect. How are we measuring that? Then it becomes a more healthy conversation of, okay, cool. I can see that we missed this particular area, or this output was off. I'd like to try adjusting by this, and then let's watch and see how that goes, right? And so you can do those micro tunings as you go through each of your sprints during your normal retrospectives if you want to, right? You can make those small tweaks. And that helps. Like, you watch and you can track as you go your way through. In our case, we do quarterly plannings. Okay. But the big thing also is when you get into the end of your quarter, it's also important to do that more broad sense of, okay, here's the whole quarter played out. Here's what we succeeded very well at. Here's the things that we didn't do well at. And we're going to go into the next quarter and we're going to have to see similar goals and similar expectations. What do we want to do differently? How do we want to think about it? How do we want to have that outside of the box way of thinking about things? And that's usually where you start to see those that did it differently in an organization that want to think about a bigger idea. It's a healthy space for that. And you can kind of like think about, how do you want to bring in those things? We at our organization, like one of our mantras is, we do things differently. Like, that's the whole idea of who we are as a company. Like, we embrace that concept. And so you can't get too far into we're different in some of these conversations, because the idea is to standardize and to hit towards the best practices. But you do need to be sure that you're thinking outside of that. I don't really have a quote unquote recipe for how I evaluate those. I think it's truly about like trying to set the right moment for when to have those conversations, and then keeping an open mind on the teams. But really it's that, like, let's watch the outputs to see how this adjusts, because we may find a really great way of doing something differently.
Right. And that's ultimately where things go back to what you've been talking about, which is that the ultimate goal, the North Star, has to be the outputs. Like, not the outputs of the process, the outputs of what the team is doing. That's kind of what we were talking about earlier with the restaurant. What needs to matter is, are better dishes going out? And understand that any process conversation needs to be anchored in, will it change the consistency, the quality, potentially even the amount of outputs at the end of the day? And if not, it's exactly like what you said, right? Is I've been in many teams that have those religious arguments. One of them, I mean, it sounds so mundane, but there was a entire meeting where people had it out, screaming at each other over whether the curly brace should be where the function is defined, or should it be on the next line down. And I think it's both good to give the team an opportunity to just get it out, to let the steam out, but then to cultivate the type of team where people understand that once the decision is made, it's an arbitrary consistency definition. Like, it isn't going to change the outputs, and any more complaining about the outputs, nobody will believe it. The point is, everyone has a preference. The team made a decision, and you just learn to move on. And, I like that, right? It's like a good way to resolve it.
Absolutely. What is it? The Silicon Valley, like the 4 spaces versus tab argument.
Yeah, the tab versus spaces for developers. Yeah.
Oh. So, I mean, but those are the things. I mean, and that's ultimately where it comes to, is that you're going to, in some of these discussions, you're going to get to the point of diminishing returns, to where truthfully, like, we could argue the merits of benefits on either side of that, right? But materially speaking, this discussion, is it going to help us on the outputs of what goes out the door, or are we arguing semantics? And so, and I think that there's a healthy discussion on both sides of that. It's always one you got to have. But at the end of the day, at some point, someone has to make that decision. I have an opinion on who, of, you know what, I hear both sides of this. For right now, we're going to go this way. And then if we want to reassess that down the line, we're going to talk our way through that again. But for today, this is what we're going to do. It's my opinion, the person that should be guiding that conversation should be the closest to that team. So I think about team leads. I think about the managers that are over those groups. In my opinion, it's the closest to it. They should be in a position to try to help foster effective and good conversation. But at the point where it's run its course, the team has to understand that we've got work we've got to do. We got to go deliver value for a business, right? And then there's that person that can be that mediator and the person that's the tiebreaker that says, this is what we're going to go do, and we're all in it together.
Yeah. And ultimately, that is one of the fun things about process, is that it helps you have that consistency, but it also helps you define what are just the things we do, because that's just how we do them.
That's right.
There are
That's right.
maybe 100 other ways, and there might be one optimal way. If you could somehow think of every variable in the universe, there might be a best way to do it. But realistically speaking, there is a class of ways to do things that are all roughly equivalent. And this is ours. And it maybe uniquely matches our set of personnel. And it also just uniquely matches a bunch of really quirky one-off decisions we made along the way that we've all just learned to live with. And now is our little signature on how to do business.
100%. Yep, definitely.
Cool. Well, very rapidly, we found ourselves at the end of our time here. So can you let people know where they might be able to find you online if they're curious in continuing this conversation?
Definitely. LinkedIn's probably the easiest way to find me. That's a great place. I'm kind of a quiet online social media presence, but that's probably the best place for me to go. I normally lay, just a little bit below, but LinkedIn's great.
Yeah. Nowadays it's pretty wild. LinkedIn there's a lot of conversation going on LinkedIn these days. So
big time.
Awesome. Well, all right. Well, that's going to be it for us today. Thank you so much for listening. And thank you to Scott for being our guest. As we like to say, the conversation does not stop here. You can find Scott on LinkedIn. You can find me on Twitter at Rob Ocel. But as we close out, we'd just like to thank today's sponsor, This.Labs, one last time, who would like me to remind you that sometimes it's hard to bridge the gap between business objectives and tech implementation, and it can get messy. This. Is trusted by top names like Meta, Google, and T-Mobile, and they love helping business leaders fulfill their strategic digital initiatives. Check them out at this.co. One more time, that's THISDOT.co. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.